The postmodernists get a lot of stick these days. And if you want to know why, look no further than Judith Butler. Butler teaches at Berkeley, which is neck and neck with Portland as the most barkingly woke place on planet Earth. And here she is, in full flow, in a single sentence that's a classic of the postmodern style. The move from a structuralist account, in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways, to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation, brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure, and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural tonalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power. Well, quite. Now, the postmodernists argue that such prose is necessary to think the world radically, while their critics argue that their lack of clarity is an attempt to obscure the fact that they lack a coherent argument. After all, if you have a good point, you'll want to make it as clearly and emphatically as you can. Their critics say this isn't clever writing, it's just bad writing. Anyway, you can make up your own mind on which of those positions is more persuasive. But Butler has many fans, and a recent interview in the New Statesman was certainly more coherent than the preceding passage. It got gushing endorsements from legions of her woke admirers. But was it actually substantial at all? Or was it just another example of the sort of impressive sounding, but rather empty and meaningless word soup that our current progressives are so fond of? Well, let's see. Butler begins by claiming that my wager is that most feminists support trans rights and oppose all forms of transphobia. So I find it worrisome that suddenly the trans-exclusionally radical feminist position is understood as commonly accepted or even mainstream. I think it is actually a fringe movement that is seeking to speak in the name of the mainstream, and that our responsibility is to refuse to let that happen. Well, this is certainly clearer than the drivel we've just read, and we can interpret her point here easily. Butler's claim is that most feminists are fully supportive of trans rights in all ways. Yet this conclusion is nothing more than a guess. She's made no attempt to do any peer-reviewed study on this topic. She appears to just claim that, as it's her position, it's probably the majority position. As if the amount of supporters an argument has somehow validates it. Yet her certainty on the issue is so concrete that she sees it as her responsibility to battle against all opposition, to simply refuse to let it happen. Butler considers it her duty to crush dissenting viewpoints, to drive them from what she calls the mainstream, even though, by her own admission, her claim to any kind of moral or intellectual high ground is based on nothing more than a guess. She even goes on to be dismissive about how fantasies pass as public argument, something she describes as a cause for worry. But Butler's next assertion is even more remarkable. Being that she has spent her entire life in gender studies, considering that this interview obsesses over trans issues, and in light of the fact that she grounds her whole argument in opposition to feminists who have concerns about the trans debate, she brushes off the idea that the term TERF is used as a slur. In fact, she actually claims that I am not aware that TERF is used as a slur. This is an utterly baffling claim for pretty much anyone to make, never mind someone recognised as a global expert in this field. It's simply mind-boggling. It's like asking a tennis expert what they make of the Federer-Nadal rivalry, and this supposed authority expressing surprise that they've ever even played. Because TERF is nothing but a slur. Has Butler spent the last decade with her eyes and ears firmly closed or something? Her supposed ignorance of this slur isn't just incomprehensible, it's actually laughable. Butler goes on to protest loudly about abuse levelled at trans people. Now, that's fine. But she doesn't express a whiff of concern over abuse directed at anyone else. I suspect, and in Butler's own terms here, I'm making a wager, that she has little or nothing to say about all the abuse directed at Trump supporters, Tories, white men, or numerous other groups. And in betting terms, I'd say the odds are pretty heavily in my favour there. That's just a guess, though it's at least born of real-world experience, rather than the isolation of a radical little bubble in an ivory tower. I mean, I'd also bet my house on her knee-jerk support for Black Lives Matter, Palestine, and every other woke cause célèbre, which she predictably rails about in the very next paragraph. Butler then sums up her argument in equally predictable fashion. She just states it as a matter of fact. It's not a proposition which she happens to hold. It's not a suggestion that she attempts to persuade us of. It's just a purely objective truth. And if only feminists could see that she is right, the TERFs would simply cease to exist. In a certain light, her case sounds superficially impressive. But it's utterly empty. She provides zero evidence and doesn't even attempt an argument. There's nothing here but assertion, a blasé assumption that she's just right. She doesn't need to prove it. She just needs to state it. This is what Edmund Burke dismissed as abstract reasoning and metaphysical speculation. Butler's become so cocooned in the warped world she inhabits, the radical little echo chamber full of nodding dupes who clap her every utterance, that she's now blithely oblivious to evidence, to reason, to attempting to construct some kind of logical case in support of her view. All she has is her belief, which, when dressed up in the flamboyant verbiage beloved by her peers, is considered sufficient proof to proclaim it as an incontrovertible fact. This culture's like the courts in leftist states, which all fell prey to the same critical error. The assumption of guilt was so total that charges alone were considered sufficient proof. Evidence and developed cases were utterly immaterial. Yet Butler completely contradicts herself too. She wants us to recognise that we are all interdependent, and that we should all be treated the same as each other. But in the very same paragraph, she's blithely dismissive about TERFs, Trump supporters, and evangelical right-wing Catholics. These are all slammed as the most reactionary forces in our society. What was that Judith said about being against all sorts of online abuse? Yeah, looks like I won that bet then. If you've enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in extensive detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.